The name on her lips tasted like a borrowed dress 2 sizes too small, and Marcella Wells had worn it clear from Missouri to the Colorado Territory without anyone asking her to take it off. It was the spring of 1873, and the land west of the Kansas border was the kind of country that swallowed whole families and asked no questions afterward. The Union Pacific had stitched the continent together only 4 years prior, and the trails between civilization and wilderness were still raw and red as fresh-cut wood. Marcella sat in the back of a covered wagon owned by a widow named Mrs. Fern Holloway, wedged between a crate of iron skillets and a rolled-up wool blanket that smelled like horse and dried sage. Her ticket west had been bought under the name Clara Wells, her sister's name, her dead sister's name. Clara had died of typhoid fever in St. Louis the previous October, 6 days before her scheduled departure for the Colorado Territory, where a land agency had arranged for homestead parcels to be distributed to single women willing to work the soil. Clara had saved every cent of her seamstress wages for 3 years to secure that parcel. She had dreamed of wide skies and clean air, and a life that belonged entirely to herself. She had pressed the paperwork to her chest the night before she fell sick and told Marcella it was the most beautiful document she had ever held. And then Clara was gone. Marcella had stood at her sister's grave in a cold October rain and made a decision that was either the bravest or the most reckless thing she had ever done. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher with no prospects and no particular reason to stay in St. Louis, where her only living family had just been placed in the ground. She took Clara's papers, Clara's ticket, and Clara's name, and she climbed aboard the first train heading west. The guilt of it lived in her sternum like a splinter she could not reach. She told herself it was what Clara would have wanted. She was not entirely sure that was true, but she was already 100 miles from anything familiar before the doubt had time to truly set its roots, and by then the horizon ahead was far more interesting than the one she had left behind. The wagon train she had joined in Dodge City was a modest one. 12 families, 2 single men, Mrs. Holloway the widow and Marcella, who had introduced herself as Clara Wells to the wagon master, and had not looked him in the eye for longer than 3 seconds at a time since. They were bound for a valley settlement called Redrock Crossing, a small town that had sprung up around a river bend in the Colorado Territory, where a post office, a general store, a church, and a blacksmith had already established the skeleton of something that might one day become real. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early May, the sky above the Redrock mesas a shade of blue that Marcella had never seen in Missouri, a blue so deep and clean it looked like the inside of a promise. The town was exactly as described, small and sun-bleached and slightly precarious looking, as if the wind had set it down and not quite decided whether to pick it back up again. A row of hitching posts ran along a main street of packed red dirt, a general store with a crooked porch, a church with no steeple yet, just a square frame and a bell hung from a timber crossbeam, a 2-story building that served as both inn and saloon, which was a common enough arrangement in 1873 Colorado. The land agency had its office in a small adobe building beside the general store, and Marcella went there first, before she even found water to wash her face, because she had learned on the journey that the homestead parcels were assigned on a first-come basis once you arrived, and several of her fellow travelers had their eyes on the same arrangement. The man behind the land agency desk was older, 50 or thereabouts, with spectacles and ink-stained fingers and the tired look of a man who had processed more paperwork than he had ever intended to process in his life. He took Clara's documents, looked them over, stamped several things, and handed Marcella a deed to 40 acres on the eastern edge of the valley, with a creek running along the southern boundary. "You are Clara Wells of St. Louis, Missouri," he said, more as a confirmation than a question. "That is what the papers say," Marcella replied, and hated herself a little for the evasion. She walked out of the land office holding a deed to 40 acres in someone else's name, and stood in the red dirt street of Redrock Crossing with the afternoon sun pressing down on her shoulders, and thought for one long moment that she was going to cry. She did not cry. She had not cried since Clara's funeral, and she was not going to start in the middle of a street in a town she did not know yet. What she did instead was look up. And that was how she first saw Cecil Alden. He was coming out of the blacksmith's shop across the street, pulling on a pair of work gloves as he walked, and he was the kind of man who moved through space in a way that suggested he was entirely comfortable occupying it. Not tall in the theatrical way of dime novel heroes, but solidly built, with broad shoulders and the kind of hands that had done actual work for a long time. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and brown eyes that caught the late afternoon light and held it for a moment before letting it go. He was wearing canvas trousers, a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a leather vest that had seen considerable use. His hat was a wide-brimmed brown felt affair that had been pushed back on his head, which gave him a slightly open, approachable look that seemed to be his natural expression rather than a performance. He saw her standing in the street and did not look away the way men sometimes did when they caught themselves looking. He simply nodded, the way people nodded in small towns where everyone was eventually going to know everyone else, and continued on his way to the hitching post where a bay mare was waiting. Marcella looked away first. She always looked away first. She found Mrs. Holloway at the inn, secured herself a room for the first 2 nights while she assessed the situation on her land parcel, and ate a quiet dinner at the long communal table where half the new arrivals were comparing notes on their parcels and the other half were getting to know the town's existing residents. The inn's cook was a Mexican woman named Rosario, who had somehow managed to produce a venison stew that tasted like it had been made in a kitchen with actual walls and time, and Marcella ate 2 bowls and felt fractionally better about her choices. She was finishing her second bowl when a man sat down across the table from her. It was Cecil Alden. He set down a tin cup of coffee and a bowl of the same stew and looked at her with an expression that was direct without being rude, the way a person looks at someone they have been thinking about since they saw them standing alone in a dirt street with the particular posture of someone carrying something heavy. "You came in with the Holloway wagon train," he said. It was an observation, not a question. "I did," Marcella said. "You got one of the Eastern Valley parcels." "I did." "Those are good acres," he said. "The creek runs clean almost all year. Good soil for vegetables and grain both. The eastern exposure means you get morning light before the valley heats up, which matters in July and August more than you would think right now." Marcella looked at him more carefully. "You know the parcels well." "I should. I surveyed most of them. I work for the land agency when they need survey work, and I do carpentry and general building work the rest of the time. I have been here going on 3 years. He extended his hand across the table. "Cecil Alden." She took his hand and shook it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely respectful. "Clara Wells," she said. Something moved across his face. Not suspicion, not exactly. More like a man who has heard a note played slightly flat and is not yet sure if it was the instrument or his own ear. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly and drank his coffee. They ate in a comfortable enough silence for several minutes, which Marcella found unexpectedly pleasant. Most men she had encountered on the journey west had filled every silence with information about themselves. Cecil Alden seemed content to let the silence be what it was. "Do you know anything about farming?" he asked eventually. "I know what I have read," Marcella said honestly. "I was a school teacher in St. Louis. I am not without learning." "Reading about farming and doing it are significantly different things," he said, but not unkindly. "The first planting season will be the hardest. Do you have anyone helping you?" "I have myself," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could not quite categorize. It was not pity, she was certain of that, because she had seen pity on enough faces since Clara died to recognize it on sight. It was something more like consideration. The look of a man doing an honest calculation. "Your parcel is 2 miles east of mine," he said. "If you need help with anything in the first weeks, fencing or building or breaking soil, you can ask. I am not making a grand offer. I am just telling you that the offer exists." "Thank you, Mr. Alden," she said. "Cecil," he said. "Thank you, Cecil." He nodded once, finished his stew, and took his coffee to the other end of the long table, where several of the town's existing men were talking about water rights and the coming summer, and Marcella watched him go and felt the borrowed name sitting on her chest like a stone. She went to bed that night in her room at the inn, which had a window that looked out onto the dark street and a hook on the door that she made sure was latched, and she lay on the narrow mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about her sister. About Clara's laugh, which had been louder than anyone expected it to be. About the way Clara had folded her dresses with the same focused care she applied to everything in her life. About the deed that was now sitting in Marcella's coat pocket with Clara's name printed on the line and Marcella's hand behind it. She had not thought this through entirely. She knew that. Coming west had felt like grief in motion. Like the only way she could keep moving after the funeral was to take Clara's dream and carry it forward. Because standing still in St. Louis meant standing still in grief, and she had not been able to do that. But now she was here, and the land was real, and the deed was real, and the name on it was a dead woman's name. And the man who had surveyed those acres had looked at her across a dinner table and called her by it. And she had answered, and it had felt like the worst kind of lie. She fell asleep before she resolved any of it. In the morning she rose early, before the town was fully awake, and washed her face in the basin and braided her dark hair and put on her most practical dress, which was brown wool and had deep pockets that she had added herself. She was 24 years old and in reasonable health and not without courage, and she had 40 acres to see about. She hired a horse from the inn stable, a steady gray gelding with calm eyes, and rode out along the eastern trail with a hand-drawn map from the land office showing her parcel's boundaries. The morning was cool and smelled of juniper, and something mineral and clean that she would later learn was the particular smell of high desert air after a cold night. The red rock mesas stood against the sky in the early light like they had been there since the beginning of all things, and were in no particular hurry to go anywhere. She found her land by following the creek. The southern boundary was exactly as the land agent had described, a line of cottonwood trees along the creek bank, their new spring leaves trembling in the morning breeze in a way that struck her as almost unbearably alive. The soil at the creek's edge was dark and soft. The eastern rise of the parcel caught the first real sun and held it. The 40 acres were not flat but gently undulating, with a natural depression in the northwest corner that she thought might serve well for a root cellar or a storm shelter. There was no structure on the land, not so much as a fence post. She stood in the middle of her 40 acres with the sun coming up over the mesa to the east, and cast a shadow that stretched long and thin across the red dirt, and she thought, well, this is Clara's dream and it will have to be mine now, and I will either learn how to build a life here or I will fail at it, but at least I will fail somewhere beautiful. She was measuring the approximate center of the parcel with her own paces, trying to determine the best location for a cabin, when she heard a horse coming along the eastern trail. Cecil Alden pulled up his bay mare at the edge of her land and sat in the saddle looking at her with that same expression of straightforward attention he had brought to dinner the night before. He was carrying a coil of rope on his saddle and a wooden stakes bag hung from his horn, the tools of a surveyor. "You are up early," he said. "So are you," she replied. He swung down from the mare and tied her to a cottonwood branch. He walked across the open ground toward her with his long, unhurried stride, looking at the land the way a man looks at land he knows well, noting things she had not yet learned to see. "I had some survey work to finish on the adjacent parcel," he said, nodding toward the north. "Saw your horse tied at the tree line and thought I would stop. He looked at the ground around her feet, the scattered marks of her pacing. "Trying to find your center. Trying to decide where to build," she said. "Not here," he said. "Too exposed. The summer thunderstorms come fast out of the southwest, and you want your cabin behind that low ridge there." He pointed toward a gentle rise to the northwest. "Gives you wind protection and still catches the morning light. And you are closer to the creek for water, but not so close that a flood year puts you in trouble." She looked where he pointed and saw that he was right. The ridge was not dramatic, not the kind of thing a person from Missouri would naturally think of as shelter, but in this landscape it was significant. "You really do know this land," she said. "3 years of surveying it," he said. "Every parcel in this valley has a story. Yours has a good one. The creek runs from snowmelt in the mountains, and it almost never dries up before September, even in drought years. The soil in the northwest quadrant is the richest in the valley, probably because of an old beaver pond that silted up a few decades back. You could grow corn and beans and squash without much difficulty if you get water to the rows." He said all of this in the matter-of-fact way of a man sharing knowledge he simply has, without any of the patronizing undertone that she had learned to brace for when men explained things to her. It sounded like how she talked to her students when she knew something and they needed to know it too. "You surveyed all 12 parcels the agency assigned?" she asked. 17 total. "Some are already settled, families that came through last fall." He picked up a handful of soil from the ground near his boot, crumbled it between his fingers. "Good loam. Whoever farmed this land before left it in good condition." He let the soil fall. "You said you were a school teacher." "I was, past tense. I left the school to come here," she said carefully. "Big change," he said. "Yes." He looked at her then, not the land, not the soil, but directly at her, and there was something in his gaze that was both gentle and penetrating, the way sunlight is both warm and revealing. "Clara is not your given name," he said. It was not a question. Marcella went very still. The morning breeze moved through the cottonwood leaves, and the creek made its steady, unhurried sound over the stones. And she stood in the middle of someone else's land, holding someone else's name, and looked at a man she had known for less than 12 hours and felt the splinter in her sternum shift and sharpen. "What makes you say that?" she said, and her voice was level. "3 things," he said, without any particular drama. "Last night when I said your name, you answered half a second late, which is the pause of a person translating. This morning when I called out from the trail just now, you turned before I said any name at all, which means you are not yet habituated to the name you are using. And your reaction right now is not the reaction of a person who has been called by their given name since childhood." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not accusing you of anything. I am a surveyor. I notice things." Marcella looked at him for a long time. The sun had cleared the mesa now, and the light was gold and full and warm, and the land around them was so quiet and so vast that she felt, for a moment, as though they were the only 2 people in a very large world. "My name is Marcella," she said. "Marcella Wells." She watched something settle in his face, a kind of quiet satisfaction, as though a measurement had come out correct. "Marcella," he said. He said it simply, the way you say a word when you want to know how it fits in your mouth. "That is a good name." "Clara was my sister," Marcella said, and then, because the truth was already moving, she told him the rest of it. The typhoid, the October rain, the deed, the borrowed name. The decision that had felt simultaneously like theft and tribute, and the only possible thing she could think of to do with her grief. She had not told anyone. Not Mrs. Holloway, not the land agent, not any of the 12 families on the wagon train. She had kept it locked inside her the entire way from St. Louis, and standing here on the land that Clara had saved for, she felt it all come out in a rush that she could not have stopped if she had tried. Cecil Alden listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the cottonwood trees along the creek. "She sounds like someone worth honoring," he said. Marcella pressed her lips together. "She was the best person I knew." "Then honor her by making something good of this land," he said. That seems more like what she had in mind than using her name to do it. The simplicity of it was so precisely right that Marcella felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for 7 months. Not gone, not healed, but loosened, the way a knot eases when you work it from the right direction. "What about the deed?" she said. "It has her name." Cecil was quiet for a moment, thinking. The land agent here is not a suspicious man. He processes documents. As long as the taxes are paid and the land is worked, he is unlikely to look twice. "You have the same surname. You could explain, if it ever came to that, that you used a family name for the application." He paused. "I am not telling you to continue the deception. I am telling you that you have options that are not as catastrophic as you may have been imagining." She looked at him with an expression she could not entirely control, something grateful and wary and uncertain all at once. "You are a very practical man." "I try to be," he said. He picked up his stakes bag from the ground where he had set it. "I should finish my work on the adjacent parcel. But I will come back this afternoon, if you have no objection, and we can put stakes for your cabin foundation before the ground gets too hard in the afternoon heat." "I would not object to that," Marcella said. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat in a brief, genuine gesture, and walked back to his mare. She watched him ride north along the trail, and then she turned back to her land and her creek and her cottonwood trees, and for the first time since October she thought that perhaps things were going to be all right. He came back that afternoon as he said he would. He brought 2 more wooden stakes from his kit, a level, and a string line, and together they marked out the footprint of a cabin, 16 by 20 feet, behind the northwest ridge in the place he had pointed out that morning. He explained as they worked, the lay of the ground, the frost line depth, the direction of the prevailing wind, and she listened carefully and asked questions, and he answered them without abbreviating anything on her account, which she appreciated enormously. When the stakes were set, they stood back and looked at the string outline on the ground, the ghost of a cabin that did not exist yet, and Marcella felt something stir in her that she had not felt in a very long time. It was not quite hope. It was something earlier than hope, the ground condition that hope requires, which is the sense that something is possible. "I will need lumber," she said. "Walters at the general store can order it. The mill in Fort Garland sends a wagon every 3 weeks. You could have the first load in a month." He squinted at the string outline. "I can help you build it if you want. I have done it before. A cabin that size, 2 people working, is about 3 weeks of solid work, maybe 4. "Why would you do that?" she asked. The question was direct but not unfriendly. He looked at her steadily. "Because you are new here and the nearest neighbor, who is already settled, is 4 miles away, and nobody should build a cabin alone in their first summer if there is someone willing to help." "Is that the only reason?" she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that neither of them named yet. "Partly," he said. And then he put his hat back on and gathered his tools and said he would see her at the inn for supper, if she was going to be there. She was there. They ate together again, not sitting across from each other this time, but side by side at the long table, with the natural ease of 2 people who have spent the day doing useful work together and have earned a comfortable proximity. Marcella found herself noticing small things about him, the way he held his cup, the precise, unhurried way he made decisions, whether about what to order from the cook or which direction to run a string line. He was not a man who performed confidence. He simply had it, in the quiet, foundational way of someone who has tested himself against real things and found himself adequate. She also noticed that, when he talked about the valley, his voice changed slightly, took on a warmth that was not present when he discussed practical matters. He had come to Colorado from Indiana 3 years ago, he told her, after a series of events that he summarized with the economy of a man who does not dramatize his own history. A farm that had failed, a family that had scattered, a restlessness that the East could not contain. "The first time I stood on the mesa above this valley and looked down at the river bend and the red cliffs," he said, "I thought, this is a place I could be, not because it is easy. It is not easy, but because it is honest. The land here does not pretend to be something it is not. What you see is what there is. Marcella thought of the borrowed name she had worn for 7 months and said nothing for a moment. "I think I understand that more than I did this morning," she said quietly. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "You can be what there is here," he said. "The valley does not care what name was on the land office paper. It only cares what you do with the soil." She thought about that for the rest of the evening and well into the night. The next 2 weeks were the busiest of Marcella's life. She moved out of the inn after the second day, choosing to sleep on her land in a canvas tent. Mrs. Holloway helped her rig from the supply wagon's cover, because she did not want to spend her money on the inn's rates when she had a tent and a bedroll and a fire pit. Several of the other new settlers expressed concern about this arrangement, particularly Mrs. Avery, one of the wagon train families, who felt that a woman alone in a tent was an invitation to trouble. Marcella thanked her for her concern and stayed in her tent. The truth was that she loved it. She loved waking to the sound of the creek and the birds in the cottonwoods. She loved the particular quality of the desert dawn, the way the light moved across the mesa faces in a slow revelation that was different every morning. She learned the sounds of the land at night, the coyotes in the upper valley, the screech owls in the juniper, the long, settling creaks of the cottonwood trunks in the dark. Cecil came to her land most mornings. Sometimes he had survey work in the adjacent parcels, and it was a natural stop. Sometimes, she gradually understood, he came simply because he had decided to. He brought things without fanfare. One morning, a bag of vegetable seed from the general store that he said a family in the valley had pressed on him because their own kitchen garden was overstocked. Another morning, a small iron pot that had been for sale at the general store, and that he thought might serve better on her camp fire than the skillet she was using. Small, practical kindnesses that he offered without ceremony, and that she accepted the same way. They built her cabin together, as he had proposed. The lumber came from Fort Garland 3.5 weeks after she placed the order with Walters at the general store, and from the first morning that Cecil arrived at first light with his tool kit, they fell into a working rhythm that surprised her with its ease. He was a good teacher. He showed her techniques once, and then expected her to do them herself, and corrected her errors with the directness of someone who respected her enough not to pretend the errors were not there. She was not without skill. She had grown up in a household where her father had taught both his daughters that a nail set properly was as important as a hem stitched properly, and she had good hands and good focus. Cecil noticed this and said so, not effusively but simply in the way he said most things. "You have a level eye," he told her one afternoon, watching her check the plumb of a wall stud. "A lot of people cannot tell the difference between straight and almost straight. You can." "Is that a compliment, Cecil?" she asked. "It is a fact," he said. "I suppose it is also a compliment." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since Clara's funeral, or so it seemed to her. It was possible she had laughed in the intervening months, but this was the first time it had felt entirely unguarded, entirely real, a laugh that came from somewhere below the careful surface she had been maintaining. He was looking at her when she laughed, and his expression was one she had not seen on him before, something open and wondering, as though the laugh had shown him something he had been wanting to see and was pleased to finally have confirmed. The cabin was framed in 8 days. The roof took another 4. The walls, with the chinking and the window frames and the door hung level and true, took a week more. When they set the last shingle and climbed down from the roof and stood back and looked at what they had built, Marcella felt a pride so clean and so particular that she had no words for it. It was not the pride of accomplishment, though it was that too. It was the pride of having built something with her own hands in a place that was now unambiguously, practically, concretely her own. "It is a good cabin," Cecil said. "It is," Marcella agreed. They stood side by side in the evening light, both of them dusty and tired and satisfied, and the distance between them was smaller than it had been on the first morning, not in space but in every other way, and Marcella was aware of it and she thought he was too. I have something I want to ask you, he said. All right, she said carefully. Nothing alarming, he said, and the fact that he had noticed her slight wariness and thought to address it made her feel a complicated tenderness. I am building a new corral on my own land next week. The one I have is not large enough for the horses I intend to keep. I could use a second pair of hands, and the work would go a long way toward teaching you how to put in posts if you ever need a fence line on your own land, which you will. She looked at him. You are offering to teach me post setting by asking for my help. Both things are true at the same time, he said. I need the help. You would learn from doing it. I do not see the conflict. She thought about it for a moment, though she had decided before she finished thinking. I will bring dinner, she said, since you are teaching. He smiled at that. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it did something to the landscape of his face that she was not going to think too carefully about just yet. That seems fair, he said. Working on Cecil's land for the first time gave Marcella a new perspective on him. His own cabin was older than hers would ever be, 3 years of settling into its foundation, with a kitchen garden already established along the south wall, and a small barn that had the organized, considered look of a workspace where a man spends real time. There was a quality of care to his property that was not the show-off tidiness of someone trying to impress, but the functional care of someone who lived attentively. Tools hung where they could be found. Firewood was stacked under a linta with the cut ends out for drying. A kitchen garden had neat rows with the spring seedlings already showing. She found herself looking at all of it with a feeling she did not immediately name. They set posts all morning in a companionable back and forth that had by now become their natural mode of working together. Him explaining the why behind each step, her doing it and asking questions when she had them, and working without comment when she did not. The afternoon turned hot, and they took a rest in the shade of the barn with their water canteens, and the lunch Marcella had brought, which was cornbread from Rosario's recipe that she had managed to produce in her new kitchen fireplace with only moderate disaster, and dried venison, and 2 early apples from Walter's General Store that had come in on the last supply wagon. They sat in the shade with their backs against the barn wall and ate and did not talk for a while, and it was, Marcella thought, one of the most comfortable silences she had ever shared with anyone. Tell me about your sister, Cecil said. Marcella looked at him. He was looking out at the open land beyond the half-finished corral, not at her, giving her the privacy of his attention being elsewhere while she decided whether to speak. She spoke. She told him about Clara, the real Clara, not the name on a deed but the woman behind it. How Clara had been 3 years younger and an inch taller and possessed of a laugh that could be heard from 2 rooms away. How she had learned to sew from their mother and had been so good at it that, by the time she was 18, the best dressmaker in St. Louis had offered her an apprenticeship. How she had spent every spare hour of the next 6 years building the savings that would buy her way west. How she had researched the Colorado territory with the focused discipline she applied to everything, and had come to dinner one evening with a sheaf of notes about soil types and growing seasons and water rights, and had laid it all out for Marcella with the excitement of a general presenting a battle plan. She was going to make something extraordinary, Marcella said. She had the capacity for it. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she was fully prepared to work for it. And then she died, Cecil said quietly. And then she died. He was quiet for a moment. Is that why you took her name? Because you wanted her dream to happen even if she could not be the one to make it happen? Marcella considered this honestly. Partly, she said, partly that I could not think of anything else to do with myself. Partly that I thought if I used her name I would be less afraid of how large and strange everything felt. She paused. None of those reasons seem entirely sufficient now that I say them out loud. They are all human reasons, he said. That seems sufficient. She looked at him, at the side of his face turned toward the open land, the strong jaw and the dark eyes with the late afternoon light in them. You are very decent, Cecil Alden. He turned and looked at her then, and there was a warmth in his expression that was no longer the warmth of a new acquaintance being courteous. It was the particular warmth of a man looking at a specific person and finding the view entirely to his liking. "You are very decent yourself, Marcella Wells," he said. "I think you may be one of the more honest people I have met, which is interesting given the circumstances." She laughed a little at that, a short, surprised laugh. "That is a generous reading." "I think it is an accurate one," he said. "You could have kept the name from me indefinitely. You told me on the second morning." That is not the behavior of a person who is comfortable with deception. She held his gaze for a moment, aware of the closeness of the barn wall and the warmth of the afternoon and the particular quality of the attention he was paying her. "No," she said, "I have never been comfortable with it." "Good," he said simply. And then he stood up and picked up his post-hole digger and said they had 3 more posts to set before the light went. And she got up and picked up her tamping bar and they went back to work. She rode home to her own cabin in the long summer twilight with the mesa walls glowing red-orange on either side of the valley, and thought about the way he had said her name that morning out in the field, the first time he had used it casually, without the slight careful quality it had carried on the first morning when it was still new. "Just Marcella, the way you say the name of someone you have gotten used to." She thought about it most of the way home. The summer deepened into July, and the days grew long and very hot in the afternoons, with the thunderstorms that Cecil had predicted rolling in from the southwest almost every evening, spectacular and brief, and utterly unlike anything Missouri had prepared her for. The first time one hit, she was in her cabin with the door latched and the fire banked, and the lightning struck the mesa not 200 yards east of her ridge with a crack that shook the walls, and she sat on her bed with her hands flat on her knees and said out loud to the empty room, "Well, Clara, you picked a dramatic country," and felt, for the first time since the funeral, that her sister was somewhere close enough to hear her. Her garden was growing. She had planted corn and beans and squash in the northwest quadrant, where Cecil had told her the soil was richest, and they were coming up with a vigor that surprised her and filled her with a specific joy that she had not anticipated, the joy of having put something in the ground and watching it insist on living. She also planted a small kitchen garden beside the cabin, following Cecil's arrangement at his own place, with onions and carrots and the herbs that were available from Walter's seed stock. Cecil came by her land regularly, 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for specific purposes and sometimes, increasingly, because it seemed to be where he wanted to be. She had stopped wondering at the fact of this and had begun simply accepting it, the way you accept a creek that runs through your land, as something that belongs to the landscape of your daily life. They fell into habits. He brought coffee on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, good coffee from the general store that was better than what she had been buying, and they drank it on her cabin steps before the day's work began. She cooked Sunday dinner and he came to it, always bringing something useful, a jug of milk from the Avery family's cow, a sack of flour, once a perfectly mended fence stretcher that he had spent an evening fixing because he had noticed hers was bent. The Sunday dinners became something they both looked forward to with a sincerity that neither of them would have admitted to directly in those early months, though Mrs. Avery, who had established herself as the valley's most attentive observer of social arrangements, had noticed and mentioned it to at least 3 people. In August, there was an incident with a water rights dispute that briefly threatened to unsettle the entire Eastern Valley. A rancher named Holt Cassidy, who had bought a large parcel 2 years before Marcella and the other new settlers arrived, claimed that his cattle had priority use of the creek above the new homesteaders' irrigation draws. This was not legally accurate, as Cecil explained to both Marcella and the other settlers affected, but Cassidy was a large man with several hired hands and a loud voice, and the legal accuracy of a situation is not always the most immediately relevant fact in the Colorado Territory in 1873. Cecil went to speak with Cassidy on behalf of the new settlers, not with aggression but with the paperwork that established the water rights clearly, and the calm, steady manner of someone who has no intention of being intimidated, but also no desire to create unnecessary conflict. Marcella rode with him because it was partly her water draw at stake, and she was not going to let someone else manage her affairs entirely, which Cecil respected without comment. Cassidy was initially hostile. He was a stout, red-faced man who had the entitled air of someone who had been the largest landowner in the valley for 2 years and had gotten accustomed to the weight of that fact. He looked at Cecil's paperwork with the skepticism of a man who does not expect documents to say things he does not want them to say. But Cecil was patient and clear, and the documents were unambiguous, and eventually Cassidy, with the bad grace of a man who has been out-argued fairly, agreed to keep his cattle above the second bend in the creek. He looked at Marcella as he said this with the assessing look of a man trying to calculate whether a woman alone on 40 acres was a permanent fixture or a temporary inconvenience. "You staying on, miss?" he asked. "Permanently," Marcella said. He grunted and went inside his house and shut the door. Riding back to the valley, Cecil glanced at her with an expression that was somewhere between amused and proud. "Permanently," he said. "Is that a question?" she said. "No," he said. "An observation. You said it like you meant it." "I did mean it," she said. And as she said it, she understood that she had passed some threshold she had not been entirely aware she was approaching, that she had crossed from the person who had come west in a panic of grief into someone who had actually arrived, who was here, who was staying. She felt Clara's presence very strongly in that moment, the way she sometimes did when something significant happened, not as a haunting but as something warmer, a company, an approval. September brought the harvest and with it the first real proof of her competence as a farmer. The corn was not magnificent. The beans were better. The squash, as Cecil had predicted that first morning over her dark soil, was genuinely good, dense and sweet and productive in a way that made her feel, when she lifted the first heavy winter squash from its vine, that she had done something real. She harvested for 3 days and filled her root cellar and traded surplus with the Avery family and brought a basket to Rosario at the inn, who tasted the squash and said in her direct way that it was better than what Walters had been selling from the supply wagons. The land agent, whose name was Mr. Paris, came by in early September for the quarterly check of all new homesteads, verifying that the land was being actively worked and improved, which was the condition of the homestead grant. He walked Marcella's acres with his ledger and noted the cabin, the garden, the plowed and planted north field, the root cellar, and the cleared irrigation draw from the creek. He was a thorough man, and thorough men sometimes ask thorough questions. "The deed is in the name Clara Wells," he said, looking at his ledger. "That is correct," Marcella said, "and you are Clara Wells." She was quiet for 1 beat, 2 beats. "I am the Wells woman on this land," she said. "My name is Marcella. Clara was my sister. She passed before she could take up this parcel. I came in her place. I have been meaning to speak with you about amending the deed." She had been planning this conversation for weeks, had rehearsed it several times, had decided that the direct approach was the only one she could live with. She watched Mr. Paris's face go through several expressions in quick succession. "Why did you not disclose this when you registered?" he said. "Grief makes people make decisions they would not otherwise make," she said honestly. "I was wrong not to disclose it immediately. I am disclosing it now." Paris looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the well-tended land around him, the proof of 5 months of serious work. "The grant was issued to a Wells woman for the purpose of homesteading this land," he said slowly. "You are a Wells woman. You are homesteading this land." He made a note in his ledger. "I will need to issue an amendment to the deed. There will be a filing fee of $1.50. "I will bring it to your office tomorrow morning," Marcella said. "See that you do," he said. But his tone was not unkind. She told Cecil that evening at Sunday dinner, which was a good beef stew she had made with the first of the dried herbs from her kitchen garden. He listened to the account of the conversation and then nodded slowly. "That was the right thing to do," he said. "It was terrifying," she said. "The right things usually are," he said. He looked at her across the table in her own cabin in the warm light of the fire she had laid in the stone fireplace they had built together, and something passed between them that had been gathering for months. "Marcella," he said. "Cecil," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I am not asking lightly, and I am not asking because it seems like the practical thing. I am asking because I have been thinking about little else for the last 2 months, and I have decided that it is better to say a thing clearly than to not say it and spend the winter wondering." Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. "Ask," she said. "I would like to court you," he said. "Properly. With your knowledge and your agreement, and with the intention, if things go the way I hope they might, of eventually asking a larger question. I am 28 years old, I have good land, I build sound structures, I have no debt and no living family obligations, and I believe I am someone you could be with and not feel diminished by. I also think, if you will forgive me for saying it, that you are the most remarkable person I have met since I came west, and possibly since I have been alive, and I would very much like the chance to know you more fully than I already do, which is already more than I know most people." The fire crackled. The wind moved through the cottonwoods outside. Marcella looked at Cecil Alden across her own kitchen table in her own cabin on her own 40 acres in the Colorado Territory, and thought about Clara, and thought about St. Louis, and thought about all the ways a life can suddenly become something you did not expect. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He let out a breath, a long, quiet breath that told her he had been more anxious about the answer than his steady manner had indicated, and she found that entirely endearing. "Good," he said. "That is very good." He stayed for another hour and they talked, differently than they had talked before, with the door of a new understanding open between them, about Indiana and St. Louis and their separate childhoods, and what they had hoped for and what had happened instead, and what seemed possible now. When he left, he pressed her hand for a moment at the door, a long, warm pressure that was not a handshake. She stood in the open doorway and watched his lamplight move east along the trail toward his own land, and felt the night air of September in Colorado on her face and thought, "I am going to be all right. Better than all right. I am going to be good." The autumn was the most beautiful thing Marcella had ever seen. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold in early October, and the aspens in the upper valley turned gold above them, and the red rock walls of the mesa held the morning light in a way that was different every day and consistently extraordinary. She had lived her whole life in Missouri and thought she knew what autumn looked like, and she had been wrong in the most wonderful way. She and Cecil went riding on Sunday afternoons through October, when the harvest work was done, and the evenings were cool enough to want a fire, but the days were still warm. They rode the trails above the valley along the mesa tops and looked down at the river bend, and the small scattered rooftops of Redrock Crossing, and talked about everything. His years in Indiana, her years teaching school in St. Louis, the books they had each read and the ones they intended to. What they thought about the railroad and the changes it was bringing, whether the town would grow or stay small, what they wanted from the next 10 years. On the third Sunday ride, he reached across the space between their horses and took her hand and held it while they rode along a high trail with the whole valley golden below them and the sky above so blue it was almost violet. And Marcella thought, without any of the wariness she had been carrying since October of the previous year, this is happiness. This is what it is. She had not forgotten Clara. She would never forget Clara. But she had understood, somewhere in these autumn weeks, what she had not been able to understand in the immediate raw grief of last winter, that carrying Clara's dream forward was not the same as living Clara's life. She was Marcella Wells, on her own land, with her own name on a corrected deed, building her own life, and loving a man who had asked for her real name before the first morning was over. Clara would have been glad of all of it. Marcella was certain of that now, in a way she had not been certain of anything for a year. In November, Redrock Crossing had its first proper community gathering, a harvest celebration organized by the church, which now had its steeple finished, a neat wooden spire that caught the evening light. The whole valley came, the new settlers and the established families, and Rosario from the inn, and Walters from the general store, and the land agent Paris, and even, in a surprising show of civic participation, Holt Cassidy, who arrived with his wife, a quietly capable woman named Margaret, who immediately proved to be far more interesting company than her husband. There was fiddle music from two of the Avery brothers, and there was food from every kitchen in the valley, and there was dancing in the church hall with the pews pushed back against the walls. Marcella wore the best dress she owned, which was dark green wool that Clara had made for her 3 Christmases ago, and she felt both the ache and the rightness of wearing it. Cecil came to the celebration in a clean white shirt and his good vest and his hat properly settled, and when the fiddles started up and he offered her his hand for the first dance, she took it and they danced in the church hall with the whole of Redrock Crossing watching, and neither of them paid the watching the slightest mind. He danced well. She should not have been surprised by this, given how well he moved in general, but it pleased her anyway. He kept his hand on her waist with a firmness that was steady and sure, and turned her through the steps of the Virginia reel with the same precise attention he brought to setting a post or checking a plumb line. "You dance well," she said. "Indiana is not without culture," he said gravely, and she laughed. Mrs. Avery, dancing nearby with her husband, caught Marcella's eye and smiled with a warmth that was entirely genuine and entirely knowing, and Marcella smiled back. After the dancing, they sat outside the church on the wooden steps in the cold November air with cups of hot cider, their shoulders touching, looking at the stars, which were profoundly numerous at this altitude in this air, a density of light that still caught Marcella's breath even after 6 months. "I have never seen stars like this," she said. "Missouri has its stars," he said. "Missouri stars are modest," she said. "These stars are entirely confident." He looked up at them and then at her, and his expression was what she had come to think of as his full expression, the one he had when he was not managing anything, not maintaining any reserve, just present and open and himself. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You said that once before," she noted. "It went well." "I hope this goes equally well," he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to marry you, Marcella Wells, if you are willing. I have not bought a ring yet because I did not want to presume, but I will go to Fort Garland and find the best one available if the answer is yes." She turned and looked at him, at the side of his face in the cold starlight, at the man who had surveyed her land and noticed her half-second pause and asked for her real name and helped her build her cabin, and listened to her talk about Clara, without once telling her how she should feel about any of it. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He turned to look at her, and the smile that came across his face was unlike any smile she had seen from him before, not the brief, contained smiles of their working days, but something full and unguarded and joyful, the smile of a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted and knows it. He kissed her then, there on the church steps in the cold Colorado night, and it was warm and gentle and entirely certain, and she kissed him back with everything she had. They were married in December, in the church that now had its steeple, on a Saturday when the sky was that deep winter blue, and the creek was frozen along the edges, and the cottonwood branches were bare and silver against the sky. The whole of Redrock Crossing came, because in a small town in 1873, a wedding was also a community event, and Rosario made the cake, which was considerably better than it had any right to be given the available ingredients, and Mrs. Avery cried, which she had apparently done at every wedding she had ever attended, which was a known fact about her and endeared her to everyone. Marcella wore Clara's green dress, altered to fit her better than it ever had, with alterations she had made herself using the sewing skills Clara had taught her years ago. She wore her hair down for the first time since she had left St. Louis, and she stood at the front of the church with Cecil Alden and said her vows in her own name, her real name, the name she had been born with and had given up for 7 months and had reclaimed, and it felt like the most honest thing she had done in a year. Cecil's vows were direct and unflowery and entirely sincere, in the manner of everything he did. He said he intended to honor her mind as well as her person, to be a partner in every real sense of the word, to help her build the life she had come west to build, and to be someone she was always glad to come home to. She thought those were the finest vows she had ever heard. Afterward, in the church hall where the harvest celebration had been 2 months before, with the fiddles playing and the whole valley celebrating, Marcella danced with her husband and felt the particular joy that comes from a life that has found its rightful shape after a period of being badly out of form. She danced with a fullness that was not just happiness but gratitude, for the 40 acres and the creek and the cabin they had built together, and the man who had noticed a half-second pause on the second morning and cared enough to ask about it. She thought about Clara, as she always did at the significant moments. She thought Clara would have loved the party. Clara had always loved a party. She thought Clara would have approved of Cecil, would have seen immediately, as Marcella had slowly, what kind of man he was. She thought Clara would have danced every single dance. The winter was not easy. No winter in the Colorado Territory was easy in 1873. The snows came in January and lasted through February and into March, and there were weeks when the trail between her land and the town was barely passable. But she had her root cellar full of squash and potatoes and onions, and she had her cabin that she had built with her own hands, and that was level and true and held the heat well, and she had Cecil, who was now her husband and who had moved onto her land rather than the other way around, because her land was better situated, and they had agreed on this without negotiation or drama. They spent the long winter evenings reading by the fire and talking and playing cards, and planning the spring planting with the focused pleasure of two people who are equally engaged in the project of their shared life. Cecil had a considerable library for a man who lived on the frontier, 2 shelves of books that he had been collecting since Indiana, and Marcella arranged them together with her own small collection on the shelves he built along the east wall of the cabin, and the combination of their books felt to her like a quiet emblem of everything else they were combining. She wrote a letter in February to the priest who had conducted Clara's funeral in St. Louis. She wrote about what she had done and why, and about the life she was building in Clara's place on Clara's land, and about the fact that she had finally, with some difficulty, made the situation legally correct and honest, and about the man she had married. She wrote that she thought about Clara every day, and that she believed the land they were farming was being put to exactly the use Clara had envisioned. She wrote that she hoped, wherever Clara was, she found this satisfactory. She did not know if the letter would reach its destination. The mail in the Colorado Territory in 1873 was a matter of hope rather than certainty. But she sent it because it needed to be sent, and because Marcella Wells had learned in the last 6 months that honesty, even belated honesty, was almost always better than its absence. Spring came early in 1874, the snow retreating from the valley floor in March and leaving the soil dark and receptive. Marcella was pregnant by then, which she had suspected since February and confirmed with the help of the doctor who had set up a modest practice in Redrock Crossing in January, a young man named Dr. Forbes who had come from Denver and who was quietly competent in the way that the best frontier doctors were. She told Cecil on a Sunday morning, sitting at their kitchen table with the coffee he had made and the early spring light coming through the east window, and his response was everything she had expected from him. He was still for a moment absorbing it, and then the slow, full smile spread across his face, the one she had come to love most. "When?" he said. "August, Dr. Forbes thinks," she said. "Late August." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it in both of his, and they sat like that in the spring morning light with the creak audible through the open window, and there was nothing more that needed to be said in that moment. The spring planting was the most ambitious yet. Cecil had broken 2 new acres on the northern quadrant over the winter using the Avery brothers' draft horse, and they planted those acres in wheat, which was the crop the valley's soil seemed best suited for over the long term. The kitchen garden was expanded. The corn field was doubled. Marcella worked in the fields until late June, when the heat and her advancing pregnancy made the long afternoon hours impractical, and then she shifted to the closer work of the garden and the preservation of the early harvest, the putting up of vegetables in the crockery jars that she had ordered from Fort Garland the previous fall. Cecil hired a young man named Thomas, the third son of the Avery family, to help with the field work through the summer months, and Thomas proved to be willing and strong and admirably untroubled by being directed by a woman, which was a quality Marcella appreciated and told him so directly, which made him blush considerably. The baby came in late August, as Dr. Forbes had predicted, in a long and arduous labor that lasted through a night and a day and into the following night, with Mrs. Avery attending, and Dr. Forbes arriving on the second morning with his bag and his steady manner. Cecil stayed close, not in the birthing room, which was the convention of the time, but in the main room of the cabin within calling distance, and Marcella could hear him moving occasionally, the sound of a man who was not able to be still but was containing himself within the available space. The baby was a boy. Cecil came in when Mrs. Avery called him, and stood at the side of the bed looking at his son with an expression that Marcella had not seen on his face before, and that she thought she would remember until the end of her life, the expression of a man who has just discovered a category of feeling he did not know existed. "He is very small," Cecil said. "They are, at first, Mrs. Avery said. "He is very red," Cecil said. "They are at first," Mrs. Avery repeated. Cecil looked at Marcella, and she was tired in a way she had no previous reference for, wrung through and exhausted and aching, and also the most purely content she had been since she could remember. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in her arms and then at her and said quietly, "We should name him something." "I was thinking James," she said. "For no one in particular. I just like the name." "James Alden," he said, and the name settled over the 3 of them in the August morning like something that had always been true. "James," she said. "Hello." James Alden was a solid and determined infant who slept in good stretches and fed well and regarded the world with the alert, considering gaze that his father had apparently been born with, because it was clearly heritable. He grew at a rate that satisfied Dr. Forbes at every monthly visit, and by November he was smiling at things that caught his attention, which included the fire, the lamp, and his father's face with special consistency. Cecil was, as Marcella had expected him to be, entirely present as a father. He was not a demonstrative man in most of his dealings with the world, but with James he was open in a way that was entirely disarming to witness. He talked to the baby while he worked around the cabin in the evenings, explaining what he was doing as though James, propped in his small pine cradle that Cecil had built in February, were a capable apprentice who needed proper instruction. Marcella watched this and loved him for it in a way that was different from the falling in love of the first months, deeper and more certain, the way love grows when it has had time to put down real roots. The second year on the land was better than the first in every measurable way. The wheat harvest was excellent, enough to fill their own stores and sell a surplus to Walters, who shipped it to the mill in Fort Garland and returned a payment that was the first real cash profit the land had produced. The corn and beans and squash were again good, and the kitchen garden had expanded enough that Marcella was regularly trading surplus with 3 other households in the valley. She had developed, without intending to, a small reputation in Redrock Crossing as a grower, and people came to her with questions about soil and seeds and planting times, and she answered them from her own experience and from the books on their shared shelves. She found this unexpectedly satisfying. She had been a teacher. She had not expected to become a farmer who taught farming. But life in Redrock Crossing was the kind of life where your skills found their uses regardless of what you had originally planned, and she found she did not mind the redirection in the slightest. In the late autumn of 1875, Cecil was asked by the land agency in Denver, which had heard of his work through the Redrock Crossing office, to take a 6-week surveying commission in the northern part of the territory. The pay was substantial, and the work was the kind of professional challenge he respected. He spent several evenings thinking about it and then talked it through with Marcella, not asking her permission but genuinely consulting her, which she appreciated with the depth of someone who has known what it is to have your counsel not sought. They agreed that he would take the commission. James was over a year old and in excellent health. The harvest was in, and the land required mostly maintenance through the winter. Rosario and Mrs. Avery had both indicated, through the organic social network of the valley, that they would look in on Marcella regularly. The money from the commission would more than cover the lumber and labor for the barn expansion they had been planning. He left in October and was gone 6 weeks and wrote to her twice, letters that were brief and factual by the standards of romantic correspondence, but that she read multiple times because they were entirely him, all information and observed detail, and the occasional dry observation that made her laugh out loud in her kitchen. She wrote to him weekly, longer letters, about James and the land and the town and the events of the valley. She wrote about the first snow of the season, which came in November and was beautiful and manageable. She wrote about Mrs. Avery's youngest daughter, who had just gotten engaged to the Walters boy, and about Rosario's new assistant in the inn kitchen, a young Apache woman named Nolly, who was, according to Rosario, a better cook than anyone Rosario had ever trained, which was high praise. She wrote about Thomas Avery, who had now taken on a permanent position managing their fields, and had shown himself to be so capable that Cecil had discussed giving him a formal wage and responsibilities, which Marcella had agreed was the right thing to do. She wrote about James taking his first deliberate steps across the kitchen floor with the focused determination of a small person who has decided to do something, and is going to do it regardless of the evidence that it is difficult. She wrote about how he had his father's eyes and her chin and his Aunt Clara's laugh, which had announced itself at 4 months old without any warning, and had startled her so thoroughly that she had sat down on the floor and cried, not from grief, but from something that was not grief at all, something closer to the feeling that the people you love do not entirely disappear. Cecil came home in late November with a surveyor's salary, and a piece of news that he presented over the first dinner he had been home for in 6 weeks, which Marcella had made as good as she could, with the best of the stores and a dried apple pie that James regarded from his high chair with great interest. The land agency in Denver is looking to establish a formal survey office in the territory, Cecil said. They asked if I would consider a partnership arrangement. Part-time commission work, mostly in the Northern Territory, with periods at home between contracts. The money is more than we are currently earning from the land alone, and I would continue the homestead. What do you want to do? Marcella asked. I want to know what you think, he said. I think you are a very good surveyor and you should be allowed to do the work you are excellent at, she said. I think the homestead is in good hands between the two of us and Thomas. I think 6 weeks was manageable, and a reasonable pattern of similar absences would be something we could live with, as long as you come home consistently and write more than twice. More than twice, he said. At least weekly, she said firmly. Done, he said. He took the arrangement in January of 1876, and it proved to be a good fit. He was home far more than he was away, the survey commissions rarely lasting more than 4 weeks at a stretch and separated by longer periods at home. The money was enough to pay Thomas a proper wage and to fund the barn expansion, and in the following spring, a second room added to the cabin, which was becoming necessary. Marcella was pregnant again by then, which she had told Cecil on New Year's Day of 1876 with the same direct simplicity with which they communicated most things, and which had produced the same quiet, full response in him, the stillness, and then the smile, and then the hand across the table. This pregnancy was easier than the first, or perhaps she simply knew better what to expect. She was 27 now and in excellent health, strong from 3 years of physical work, with a body that had learned the rhythms of hard physical life in a way that her Missouri schoolteacher self would not have recognized. She worked her fields and her garden and made preserves, and managed the household with a competence that was genuinely hers now, not borrowed and not in question. The baby was a girl, born in September of 1876, with a full head of dark hair and an immediate and absolute opinion about being hungry, which she expressed with considerable volume. They named her Clara. It was Cecil who suggested it. He said it carefully, with the consideration of a man who understands the weight of a name, and asked if she thought it was the right thing. Marcella held her daughter for a long moment and looked at the dark hair and the small, fierce face and the hands that were already searching for something to hold. "Yes," she said, "it is exactly the right thing." Clara Alden grew into her name with the same vigor that the first Clara Wells had brought to everything she did. She was a loud, determined, cheerful child who from her earliest months seemed to have a clear sense of what she wanted and a strong preference for getting it. She adored her brother James, who was 2 years older and regarded her with the careful, slightly baffled attention of a child who has been the only child and is still adjusting to the amendment. James adjusted, as it turned out, very thoroughly. By the time Clara was 6 months old, he had appointed himself her primary protector from all perceived threats, which included the family cat, unexpected loud noises, and anyone who approached her cradle without what he considered adequate advance notice. The years moved through the valley in their seasons, each one building on the last with the steady accumulation that is the true experience of frontier life, which is so often represented in stories as a series of dramatic events, but is in truth mostly the daily labor of building something lasting out of stubborn raw material. The wheat grew and was harvested and grew again. The cattle that Cecil purchased in the spring of 1877, 5 good mixed-breed cattle from a ranch in the lower valley, became 15 by 1879. The cabin became a proper house, with a second story added in the summer of 1878, built by Cecil and Thomas, and 2 of the Avery brothers over the course of 6 weeks in a project that James, now 4 years old, supervised with absolute seriousness from the ground below. Redrock Crossing grew around them. By 1878, there was a proper school, which Marcella had been instrumental in establishing, writing letters to the Territorial Education Office and organizing the Valley families, and eventually donating a half-acre of her land's eastern edge for the building site. When the school opened, she was offered the position of teacher, which she accepted with the private thought that Clara would have found this development entirely expected and not at all surprising. She taught the Valley's children with the same combination of high standards and genuine affection that she had brought to her St. Louis schoolroom, and added to it the particular authority of someone who had built a home with her own hands and grown food in difficult soil and understood firsthand that learning was a form of the same work. Her students adored her. James, when he was old enough to attend, sat in the front row and regarded his mother's lessons with an expression of proprietary pride that made the other children laugh and made Marcella keep her own expression very carefully neutral. In the autumn of 1879, 6 years after Marcella had arrived in Redrock Crossing with her borrowed name and her sister's deed, and her grief wrapped around her like a winter coat, she sat on the steps of the house that had grown from the cabin they had built together, and watched the evening light move across the mesa faces in the slow golden revelation that she still found extraordinary after 6 years of watching it. James was 5 and currently in the yard chasing the cat, which had survived this game for the entire 5 years of his life, with the philosophical resignation of a cat who has assessed the odds and determined that running is adequate. Clara was 3, sitting in the yard with a collection of small stones arranged in patterns that she was treating with intense creative seriousness. Cecil came around the side of the house from the direction of the barn, pulling off his work gloves, and sat down on the steps beside her. He smelled like hay and horses and the end of a good day's work, which was a smell she associated with every possible form of comfort. He looked at the yard, at James and the cat and Clara and her stones, and then at the mesa faces and the sky above them, and did not say anything for a moment. "The wheat yield was the best yet," he said. "I know," she said. "Thomas told me this morning. We will have enough to double the seed stock for next year and still bank a surplus," he said. "Good," she said. They were quiet for a moment with the sounds of the early evening around them, the children, the animals settling in the barn, the creek in the distance. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "The morning I saw you standing in the street," he said. "That first afternoon. You were standing there with a deed in your hand and this expression that was trying to be composed and not quite making it, and I thought, that is a person with a great deal on her mind, and I wanted to know what it was." "And now you know," she said. "And now I know," he agreed. He turned and looked at her, and the brown eyes that she had loved for 6 years had the same quality of warm, direct attention that they had always had, unchanged by time or familiarity, still the gaze of a man who sees the person in front of him and finds the view good. "Are you happy, Marcella?" he said. It was the kind of question that a person could rush to answer without actually answering, and she did not rush. She looked at her children in the yard and her land stretching out to the cottonwood line, and the mesa walls that she now knew in every season and every light, and she thought about the schoolroom in the valley where her students learned to read and figure, and about the root cellar full of the year's harvest, and about the corrected deed in the document box under their bed with her name on it, her real name, and about Clara, who was always somewhere in the back of her mind like a companion on a long road. "Yes," she said, "I'm very happy, Cecil." He nodded slowly, satisfied, the way he was satisfied when a measurement came out right. "Good," he said, "I am also very happy." He reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that on the steps of their house, while the light moved through its last beautiful changes on the mesa walls, and the children played in the yard, and the evening star appeared above the eastern ridge. First one and then two and then many, the same profoundly numerous Colorado stars that she had stood under on that November evening 6 years ago when he had asked the larger question, and she had said absolutely yes. James caught the cat and held it up in triumph. Clara knocked over her stone arrangement and began rebuilding it with equal concentration. The creek ran in its steady voice over the southern boundary of their 40 acres. The cottonwoods along the bank stood in their evening gold, patient and enduring, the same cottonwood trees that had been trembling in the spring breeze on the first morning when Marcella Wells had stood on her land and decided she was going to build something here, something real, something lasting, something that was hers. In the spring of 1880, when the valley was green again and the creek was running full from the mountain snowmelt, Marcella planted a cottonwood seedling in the northwest corner of the land near the root cellar, where the soil was richest. She planted it with the particular care of someone who knows that the tree will outlast them, who is planting something for a future they will not fully see. She had planted it, she told Cecil that evening, for Clara. For the sister who had saved and planned and dreamed, and who had not lived to stand on this land and see what it could be. Cecil looked at the small planted tree in the rich northwest soil, and then at his wife and said, "She would have been proud of you. She would have been proud of both of us," Marcella said. He put his arm around her in the spring evening, and they stood together beside the small tree that was just beginning to put out its new leaves, trembling slightly in the breeze, alive and determined, and full of everything that was yet to come. Above the valley, the mesa walls were the color of rust and copper in the last light, and the sky was turning deep and clear, and somewhere behind them the children were coming in from the yard, and the house that they had built together was warm with the fire that had been laid in the stone fireplace, and the creek ran along the southern boundary in its unchanged, unhurried voice, and the life they had made here was full and real and entirely, honestly their own.